Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this video and into my studio here in Florence, Italy. Today we will be taking our clay skull that we sculpted quite a while ago, and we will be making a silicone and plaster mold of it and cast ourselves a copy in plaster using a rotocasting technique. So let's get into it. Everything you'll see will be in chronological order, and so if you'd like to start from the proper beginning, there are links below to the series on sculpting the skull where I go in depth and detail all the steps taken to get the skull to this level. To make the mold, we'll start off with applying the silicone. It is the trusty Bluesil RTV 3325P silicone from Blue Star Silicones. It's a paste silicone that's applied by hand. A similar silicone in the US is Resilpalm that you can get from the Complete Sculptor in New York. They are pretty much the same thing. I mix and apply the silicone by hand. Now I don't recommend mixing it by hand. Some people are a bit allergic to it, and I'm sure mixing it by hand is not the healthiest thing in the world, so use gloves. I don't use gloves because the silicone sticks like crazy to the gloves and it's impossible to apply for me that way. But you can use sunflower seed oil or some other sort of oil to make that go a little bit easier. Or you can perhaps mix it with gloves and apply it with bare hands. The way that I try my best to work around that is that I always try to add the catalyzer to the middle of a lump of silicone and then mix it in without getting any on my hands. But I'm not always super successful doing this, so again I'd recommend using gloves just to be safe. If you're not working in a well-ventilated area, you should probably use some sort of respirator also. I'm in the sculpture studio building here, which is a big and open space with pretty good airflow. The first layer has to be applied carefully to not disturb the finished clay surface. So short nail is a must, so you don't ding your perfectly sculpted surface. I apply silicone very slowly and take care to build up an even thickness, or as even as I can. Usually I go by feel here. I can kind of feel how thick my layer of silicone is as I'm spreading it out over the surface by how easy it spreads out and kind of how squishy it feels. And with enough practice you'll be able to do this as well, and it helps you control the thickness. Because of the type of mold I'll be creating, or the type of cut I'll use to free the sculpture from the silicone, a mohawk cut, I need something to ensure the cut running up from the back of the skull and ending around the forehead, just like a mohawk, doesn't rip. This is why I add this round stick into the forehead of my sculpture, turning it into a unicorn skull. This wooden stick will be at the end of my silicone cut. I'll cut from the back of the skull up to the stick. And if it wasn't there, the cut would rip almost every time I flex the mold open, as it would just end very abruptly. But with the unicorn horn, or wooden stick, at the end of my cut, the cut will end in a round circle, and it probably won't rip on me, and the mold will last a lot longer. This is what I've found to be the most reliable and long-term answer when making a mohawk cut in your silicone molds. You can also, at the end of the cut, make kind of a T, but that doesn't last as long as this, because it'll still rip. But this step obviously needs to be planned out from the beginning, because the wooden stick must be attached into the clay for this to work. So you end up with a hole in your mold, which is not necessarily ideal, but you can pretty easily fill that with clay when casting and then just clean it up afterwards. Around a few millimeters is fine for the first layer, like on the border of being translucent is what I usually go for. The next layers will be thicker, and the first layer is really there to only capture the details, and keeping it thinner means less chance of catching air bubbles or water bubbles. As you can see, I put water on my hands to keep the silicone from sticking, and the bowl of water is that white thing at the bottom of the frame there. Usually I do 3 layers, but I got kind of impatient here and worked extra fast and extra thick and added only 2 layers. Smaller sculptures you can get away with 2 layers, but with bigger sculptures you really need 3 layers. And you'll probably get better results with 3 layers if all layers are a little bit thinner, less air bubbles and water bubbles. I just got kind of impatient and bored. It's only a skull, right? So let's get it over with. Once all the layers of silicone is completely set up, I'd probably wait about 12 hours just to make sure it's thoroughly set up. I can begin to build the wall. A lot of times, if you've seen other videos, you've seen me use pink catalyzer in the silicone to speed this step up. Pink or red catalyzer just sets up faster. But I guess I didn't have any at this point when I shot this video, so I went old school and used the normal yellow one. The downside is that the yellow catalyzer will take a while to set up, and if you add too much silicone to your wall, it will start to sag under its own weight, which means you have to chase after it and hold it up and make sure that it doesn't lose its shape, which is mighty annoying. So to combat this, I add just a little bit of silicone at the time, in 2 goes I believe here, and let the first go set up before attempting the second one, so there's not too much fresh silicone up there at the same time. I surround the wooden stick with silicone so the end of the wall is slightly in front of the stick. The end of the cut will be at the wooden stick. The cut will travel up the back of the skull and to the wooden stick, like a mohawk. Therein lies the name of the mold, of this type of mold, I guess, a mohawk mold. I do my best to make sure the final wall is nice, even and square. This gives the best registration with the plaster jacket we'll make later. And keeping the silicone clean and even on all over the surface ensures that there are no large bumps and lumps that will cause misregistration with the plaster jacket if the silicone shrinks slightly. And this silicone is quite prone to shrinking, so it is an important thing to keep in mind. This is a good time to mention my Patreon page. If you are interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or via video chat, my Patreon is the place for you. You will get in-depth feedback on techniques and how you can apply them to your own work. Anything sculpture related goes. We can talk about armatures, supplies, mold making, anything you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. Once the silicone is all set up, I'd probably wait a day or so for that to happen. It's time to move on to the plaster jacket. The plaster jacket will be split into 3 pieces, a mask for the front and then 2 pieces on either side of the mohawk cut on the wall. Because of the deep eye sockets on the skull, there are some deep undercuts that I have to work around. A mask piece works well in this case because no part of the mohawk cut will end up underneath the mask. The silicone wall is in between the 2 pieces, the 2 side pieces of the plaster. So this works out well, I think. To begin separating the plaster pieces, I make a clay wall. I always do my best to make the nicest mold that I can in case I have to hand it off, and it's always good to have good craftsmanship and workmanship. So I clean up the clay as best as I can, using some of my sculpting tools, and I also carve 2 big even craters, I guess, for registration on each side in the clay wall that will end up transferring then into the plaster piece, so that my separate plaster pieces will register back together really well in the same place every single time. In addition to these 4 registration marks, I'll also drill holes and bolt the pieces together so they'll hold together really tightly, and I don't have to rely on bungee straps or tape or anything like that to hold my plaster pieces together. No Vaseline is necessary on the silicone, and the plaster won't be touching any wood, so no release needed in this case, in this part of the process. That'll come into play later, and I'll mention that when it happens. Silicone doesn't really stick to anything, and definitely not plaster. I mix up a bowl of plaster. I use cold water. Hot water makes the plaster set up faster, so it's your choice if you want to work fast or slow, but in this instance I had time, so I used cold water. Always add plaster to the water, not the other way around, and I add it slowly and evenly, sifting it from that little cup, letting the plaster settle in the bowl between each time I sift a new cup of plaster in. I keep going and build it up in my mixing bowl until there is a little bit of an island of plaster above the surface of the water. Then I let it sit without mixing it for a few minutes, letting the plaster powder soak in before I mix it. Letting it sit for a few minutes just makes mixing a lot easier. It soaks the plaster real well, and the finished mix is a lot more even and has less lumps of plaster that needs breaking up if you let it sit and mix up a little bit first. The first layer is called a splash coat, and I apply it with a simple brush, trying to keep an even thickness and making sure every area is covered. In this case, I want to cover it at least by a few millimeters, so anywhere that's somewhat translucent, I go over it again, making sure that everything is covered well in plaster. Once you've added kind of the first layer of plaster, you'll need a light touch when you're adding wet plaster on top of wet plaster, so you don't move the plaster that you've already added. But this is kind of a practice thing, and you get better at it the more you do it. Also remember to wash your brush of plaster in a bucket so it doesn't die. Do not wash your brush in the sink, because then your sink will die. Next step in the plaster jacket making process is to add strength and integrity to our plaster jacket. I do this by adding burlap, but there are other fibers you can add. For a small mold like this, burlap is perfectly fine. 3-4 layers is more than enough. Maybe 2 layers would have been fine. I think maybe I only add 2 layers here actually. I fold my piece of burlap over every single time, but I make sure that they all overlap. To help the burlap stick to the dried splash coat, I do another quick splash coat so that the plaster is a little wet, and then I soak the burlap piece in plaster. Then I squeegee it out, and while the splash coat is still fresh, I apply the burlap and work it in with my hands. A couple of important things to note here is to make sure that every piece of burlap overlaps the other. Now if you don't do this, the mold will have no strength or integrity, because the whole point is to have burlap holding onto burlap. Doesn't work if the burlap doesn't overlap with each other. And you will also need a light touch to not smash through your splash coat that you already applied, but you will kind of need to balance that and be firm so that there's no air bubbles between the burlap and the splash coat, as this would likely cause a crack or a hole from the inside of the mold. If there's 1 or 2 of these holes, that's no big deal. That happens often and you can fix it and fill them. But if they're everywhere, then your mold is severely compromised and it's a bit of a mess to deal with. So be firm but gentle. The walls where the pieces of plaster will meet needs reinforcement to support the bolts holding them together. Most of the stress in the plaster pieces will occur here, so I take a few extra minutes to build a very nice square wall of plaster. Now, a couple of reasons for the walls being square and nice. Number 1, somebody might be working with them, and keep in mind that I will run bolts through these walls with washers that will rest against the surface. So you'd want it to be nice and square to the direction of the hole you are going to drill, so that the washers will rest evenly on the surface of your plaster. And if you can't do it all with wet plaster, a rasp always helps, cleans it up and gets rid of any sharp bits and ensures squareness. Okay, you wait until the plaster has set up, wait until the plaster cools down a bit, and then you can begin removing the clay wall. Plaster will heat up as it sets up, and it's a good idea to wait until it begins to cool down before messing around with it too much. It's actually quite fragile until it begins to cool. I clean off the clay with some sculpting tools, and I prefer to use wooden tools here, just because metal tools scratch the plaster pretty easily. And I also spray some water and use a brush to clean it off. Every plaster surface where new plaster will be added, like the wall here, gets Vaselined. And you want to be very thorough about that. Otherwise the plaster pieces will stick together and you won't be able to take them apart without potentially destroying them. When using plaster, you essentially want to Vaseline everything you don't want the plaster to stick to. While I can still see where my registration bumps are on the first piece, I mark them out on the back of the first piece so I know where I'm going to drill holes. I mark them out with a black marker, just so that I don't drill straight through the registration and ruin them. I've done that a few times. So that's an important thing to kind of keep in mind. Then it's rinse and repeat plaster steps. The last piece, the other side, then gets made, just like that. Once all the plaster is set up, I'd probably wait another day for this, or at least a few hours. We have to drill holes to bolt the pieces together, and then we can finally take the plaster pieces off. Now if I have time, I'd let them dry for a day or so before taking them apart, as I have heard that moist plaster, wet plaster, can actually flex a little bit, which is not so good. And I clean them up with a rasp a little bit so no one gets cut by sharp plaster edges. To cut the silicone and release the sculpture from its yellow prison, I use a special knife called a mold maker's knife or a mold cutter's knife. They have a slight bend in them which transfers to the silicone when you cut it and ensures great registration every time. You can also just use an X-Acto blade or something and wiggle your cut, or just do a straight cut. Both works fine. The silicone flexes off no problem, but I'm careful not to rip it. This is a good time to mention my Patreon page. If you are interested in learning sculpture from me personally and get feedback on your work either on email or via video chat, my Patreon is the place for you. So check it out, there's a link in the description below. Okay, on to casting. We will be casting in the mold we just made using plaster and a rotating casting method or technique. Remember to plug the hole left by the wooden stick with some clay so we don't have plaster running out everywhere. We'll mix the plaster the same way as before, except now we take real care to make sure we mix it very evenly. I then pour my mixed plaster into the mold and slowly rotate it around for a while. I kind of shake it around, trying to hit it a little bit, make sure that air bubbles pop. And then I pour all the plaster out and repeat the process. I think I probably went through about 3 full bowls of plaster, leaving me with a cast about 1 centimeter or maybe 2 centimeters thick, which is plenty thick enough, probably too thick, but rather safe than sorry, as I always say. As you can see right here, it's important to have a decent sized opening at the bottom of your mold for this technique to work well. For smaller, simpler pieces like portraits, this is a great casting method, which gives great results with minimal work casting and minimal work repairing the seam afterwards. Once the plaster is cooled down and set up for a few hours, or if you have time, I prefer to leave it overnight or maybe even for a couple of more days, I open the mold and reveal the plaster skull. The casting came out great, with very little to no seam to repair, which is great. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, I encourage you to check out my Patreon page. I give feedback and critiques on people's work, and we talk about whatever you need help with in your sculpting endeavors. Check it out, the link is in the description below. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for a new video next Thursday. Subscribe and hit the bell to be notified whenever a new video comes out. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button and share with your friends and family. It really helps me out a lot. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.